Hi everyone, it's Dr. Ramani. Welcome back to this YouTube channel on narcissism, narcissistic relationships, healing from narcissistic relationships, and making sense of the whole mess. Today I want to talk about loneliness. And interestingly, loneliness is being called an epidemic, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. Any of you who have been watching the news on this, and honestly this is something that's been floating around for a long time, but the US Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy, has called loneliness an epidemic, noting that even before the pandemic, 50% of people said they were experiencing loneliness. And the research out there suggests that loneliness is associated with a whole bunch of stuff: sleep problems, inflammation, immune decrements in your immune functioning, pain, anxiety, even frank health risks for heart disease, diabetes, dementia. Loneliness is not good for us. We're a social species, right? He goes on to say that social connection is essential. It is, like I said, human beings are a primate species and a social species. We need social connection. It is part of humanness. So if that's the case, then he lists out these different pillars of his program to address loneliness. Fund parks and other places of social connection in communities. Teach healthcare providers to look for disconnection in their patients and look at the effects of it. To do research and encourage people to have social contacts. I had to dig a ways, though, through all he had written to get to what I thought was the most important conclusion of all. One thing that the Surgeon General suggested: decrease the amount of time spent in unhealthy relationships. Well, we know what that means. What this tells me is that a sense of loneliness can be increased by spending time in narcissistic toxic relationships. Because I gotta tell you, when I keep hearing about this epidemic of loneliness, that's the first place I go to. I have no doubt that people are lonelier. The way we live now and all that, people are lonelier than ever. But this isn't about building parks. Way too many people waste too much of their social connection time dealing with the toxic and obligatory relationships they have. And to spend time in a toxic space magnifies loneliness. I know that people who are in or who have been in or grew up in narcissistic and antagonistic systems and spaces, that there's a tremendous loneliness in that. A sense of isolation, of otherness, of not having a safe space like a family to land in. They may exist, but they're not safe, they're not comforting. And of feeling disconnected after years, for example, spent in a toxic marriage in which you lose social contacts, whether you stay in it or you leave it. Now, I get it. The population's graying. There are more and more older Americans who don't have as much contact, who may live away from family, who may not have a family, who may have lost a long-term spouse or partner. Sure, and I know that takes a toll. But we really need to vigorously expand this conversation about loneliness to include what happens to people who experience toxic relationships, because that is the group I witness not only struggling the most with loneliness, but also having that long list of health issues that lonely people are more vulnerable to having. Now, one of the most painful things that a person in a narcissistic relationship can experience is that people look at you and think, well, you're married or you have family around you, so you aren't one of the lonely ones. But yet, people who are in narcissistic marriages, narcissistic relationships, or families, they're the loneliest ones of all. Stuck in the middle of an invalidating group of people, not having the time to create healthier networks of people, and having their sense of self diminished by the invalidating horde they're having to spend time in, which, of course, you're spending all this damn time with them. It makes it harder to create healthier social connections with healthy people. If you want to beat loneliness, it's not just about making connections. It's about healthy connections with people who really see you. If we want to tackle the epidemic of loneliness, we don't need lots of research. Anyone who has been lonely will tell you that it sucks and that they felt the worst for it. I'm not sure that we need hundreds of millions of dollars in research to prove that. And building a park is not going to excavate the soul pain that people have experienced from a lifetime of invalidating relationships. Loneliness isn't just the literal presence of other human beings. It is also the existential loneliness of feeling that you are the only one in a situation, of feeling ashamed at the dysfunctional relationships you are in or have been in, and having to carry the shame of those toxic people. Many people cannot cut free from these relationships. Divorce is too expensive. We do not give people the ability to create the childhoods they need to create the psychological infrastructure that gives them the permission they need to seek out safe relationships. We shame people who are estranged from their families. These people are deeply lonely because of what is happening around them. They may literally and physically have people around them, but that existential aloneness can devastate a person. Maybe if they're going to put it into something, resources around loneliness, maybe protect children who are being emotionally abused. Maybe create safer ways for people to get out of emotionally abusive relationships. Maybe create better access to better therapy. You want to address loneliness? Let's just cut to the chase. This isn't about creating senior social centers, though I'm 100% behind that, and I think that could help. But you really want to get to the core of this? This is about protecting people who are isolated through the scourge of invalidation and manipulation and toxic relationships. I do not disagree. As a psychologist, I see it. Loneliness is a huge public health issue. I've witnessed it since my graduate school days and training nearly 30 years ago when I was learning to be a shrink. It was endemic then. It's worse now. But let's also open our eyes to what really drives a lot of the loneliness out there. It's not just a numbers game, but the despair and existential aloneness that comes from being in relationships in which we are not seen. That's at the heart of this. I've worked with many clients who come from big families in which not one person was ever willing to recognize, acknowledge, or clearly see the people in it. Instead, they were invalidating and manipulating them. And that resulted in a deep loneliness that often wasn't seen as loneliness because they were believed to be from a big family. This focus on loneliness, I think it's great. I think it's great it's being framed as a public health issue. But it will only be meaningful if we expand the conversation to talk about how toxic relationships may be one of the primary contributors to the sense of loneliness and isolation that so many people feel these days. Thanks again.